The metallic gleam of Kieran's armor caught the fading light as he walked through the bustling streets of Zenthera's capital, Veldara, a sprawling nexus of trade and intrigue on the edge of the galaxy. His bronzed arms and shoulders, exposed by the short sleeves of his combat gear, drew occasional glances from merchants and travelers. He ignored them. After 6 years as a contract security operative in the fringe worlds, Kieran had learned to block out unnecessary distractions. Ahead, the sprawling starport pulsed with activity. Vendors shouted over the din of hovering transport carts, their wares ranging from exotic spices to alien tech. Kieran adjusted the plasma blade strapped to his thigh, though he doubted he'd need it. His real edge was the reinforced alloy vest covering his torso, a gift from a client whose family he'd saved during the Garen Revolt. That's when he saw her. She moved through the crowd with a fluid grace, her teal skin glowing faintly in the twilight. Her attire was unmistakable, a royal gown with intricate patterns of shimmering silver and cerulean, its high slits revealing long, toned legs. The circlet resting on her head confirmed her status. This was no ordinary woman. Her matching teal hair flowed in a cascade down her back, catching the dimming light like liquid silk. Kieran's cybernetically enhanced senses, a relic of his military past, picked up the threat before his brain registered it. A rustle in the shadows, the sharp creak of a bowstring being drawn taut. "Down," he barked, already lunging forward. The woman spun toward him, her bright golden eyes widening in surprise. Time slowed. Kieran caught the glint of arrows streaking toward her. He didn't think he couldn't. His body reacted on sheer instinct. 3 strides brought him between her and the projectiles. The first arrow ricocheted off his shoulder plate with a sharp ping. The second found the soft joint under his arm, punching through his flesh. The third and fourth struck his back, the searing pain blooming like fire. Through the haze of agony, Kieran heard the panicked shouts of bystanders and the frantic footsteps of the retreating attackers. He staggered, turning to the woman. "Are you hurt?" Her voice trembled. No, I'm fine. But you're good." He gritted out, his vision swimming. "We need to move, in case they come back." Before he collapsed, her surprisingly strong hands caught him. Somewhere nearby, the shrill hum of approaching security drones pierced the air. "Too late as always." "My ship is nearby," she said urgently. "Can you walk?" Kieran nodded barely. She guided him to a sleek transport parked nearby, its design unmistakably regal, with curved lines that shimmered like flowing water. They barely made it inside before Kieran slumped into the passenger seat, his vision tunneling. The last thing he saw was her concerned face hovering over him, framed by her glowing teal hair. Kieran woke slowly. Warmth enveloped him, a softness pressing against his cheek. His senses, dulled by pain and exhaustion, gradually sharpened. The faint scent of something floral, alien yet soothing, tickled his nose. His head rested against something soft, firm, but undeniably warm. As consciousness returned, he realized it was the chest of the woman he'd saved. She was leaning over him, her fingers expertly applying a cool salve to his wounds. Her touch was gentle, her hands steady. She didn't notice his eyes flutter open, nor the faint smirk creeping across his lips. For all the firefights and ambushes Kieran had endured, this was certainly the most interesting way he'd woken up. "You're remarkable," she murmured almost to herself. Her fingers traced the edges of an old scar on his back. "Such resilient biology. These wounds should have killed you. Yet you're already healing." "Military-grade stubbornness," Kieran rasped, startling her. The woman gasped, pulling back with wide eyes. Her cheeks flushed an adorable shade of teal. "You're awake. Not for long if you keep poking me like that." He grinned, but it quickly turned to a wince as the motion tugged on his wounds. "Stay still," she ordered, her embarrassment melting into concern. "The Regan gel hasn't fully set. What's a little more pain between friends?" He joked, though her worried expression made him regret it. "I owe you my life," she said softly. "No one's ever done something like that for me before." Kieran chuckled weakly. "You'd be surprised how often I ruin perfectly good armor for strangers." Over the next week, Kieran recovered in the luxury of the royal palace. He learned her name, Aura Valen, princess of the Sapphire Dominion, a powerful noble house. The assassination attempt was one of many threats she faced as her family rose in influence. What surprised Kieran most wasn't the danger she faced, but the connection that grew between them. Aura wasn't the distant, untouchable noble he'd expected. She was sharp-witted, curious about human culture, and unafraid to tease him mercilessly. One evening, as the twin moons rose over the crystalline towers of the Valen estate, Aura visited his quarters. She wore a flowing gown that shimmered like starlight, her hair adorned with delicate jewels that reflected the light. "You look incredible," Kieran said, momentarily forgetting the pain in his shoulder. "Do I?" she teased, stepping closer. "Or is that the painkillers talking?" He laughed, shaking his head. "Definitely not the meds." Their banter faded as the space between them vanished. Aura's hand rested lightly on his chest, her golden eyes searching his face. "I've read a lot about humans," she murmured, her voice dipping lower. "Your strength, your loyalty, your passion. Sounds like you've been doing your research," he replied, his heart pounding. "Extensively," she said with a sly smile. "But there's one thing I'd rather experience firsthand." Before Kieran could respond, she leaned in, her lips brushing his in a kiss that set his senses alight. The past week had been filled with near-death experiences and unanswered questions, but in that moment, none of it mattered. When they finally broke apart, Aura's eyes gleamed with mischief. "I think I owe you more than just gratitude, Kieran. Shall we call this a start?" Kieran smirked, pulling her close again. "A very good start." Kieran stood on the balcony of his new quarters, the crystal towers of the Valen estate glittering like a sea of stars under the twin moons of Zenthara. The soft night breeze carried the faint hum of distant hovercrafts and the fragrant scent of alien blossoms. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos that had brought him here. For the first time in years, he wasn't focused on an imminent threat or planning his next move. Instead, his thoughts wandered to Aura. The memory of her touch, the way her lips lingered on his, sent an involuntary warmth coursing through him. He'd been in dangerous situations before, too many to count, but none of them had made him feel as unsteady as being near her. The sound of soft footsteps behind him pulled him from his thoughts. "You're restless," Aura said, her voice like a melody in the quiet night. He turned to find her standing in the doorway, dressed in something simpler than her usual regal attire. A loose tunic that fell just above her knees, its silken fabric shimmering faintly in the moonlight. Her hair, usually adorned with intricate jewels and braids, tumbled freely over her shoulders. The sight was disarming, and for a moment, Kieran forgot how to speak. "Restless is my default," he replied, leaning against the railing. "Old habits from living on the edge." She stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the polished floor. "You don't have to live on the edge anymore. You're safe here." Kieran let out a dry laugh. "Safe? You've got half the noble houses on this planet plotting to kill you, and by extension me. Safe isn't exactly the word I'd use." Her lips curved into a small smile as she came to stand beside him. "You're not wrong. But for now, we have this moment." Silence settled between them, comfortable but charged. Kieran glanced at her, noticing the way her golden eyes reflected the moonlight. "You've been quiet since this morning," she said softly, not looking at him. "What's on your mind?" He hesitated, then decided there was no point in holding back. "Your father." Her gaze flicked to him, curious. "What about him?" Kieran rubbed the back of his neck. "He's an intimidating guy. The kind of man who doesn't waste time on people who don't have something to offer. Makes me wonder what he really expects from me." Aura's expression softened. "My father may be calculating, but he's not heartless. He values loyalty above all else, and you've already proven yours by saving my life." Kieran crossed his arms. "And the part where he's hoping I'll strengthen the bloodline? That's not exactly subtle." A soft laugh escaped her. "He's not subtle, no, but the decision isn't his to make. It's mine." The weight of her words hung in the air, and Kieran felt his chest tighten. "And what decision are you leaning toward?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Aura tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made him feel like she could see straight through him. "I haven't decided yet," she said, though her teasing smile suggested otherwise. Before he could respond, a sharp chime echoed from the comm panel on the far wall. Aura's smile faded, and her expression turned serious. "That's the palace security channel," she said, striding to the panel. With a swipe of her hand, the screen lit up, displaying the face of a stern-looking guard. "Your Highness," the guard said, his tone clipped. "We've detected unauthorized movement near the eastern perimeter. We believe it may be an infiltration attempt." Aura's brows knit together. "Have you identified the intruders?" "Not yet, but they've managed to evade our patrol drones. Their tactics suggest professional operatives." Kieran was already moving. He grabbed his plasma blade and a lightweight chest plate from the nearby rack. "I'll handle it," he said firmly. Aura turned to him, alarm flickering across her face. "You're still recovering, and this is exactly why you hired me," he interrupted, strapping the chest plate into place. "To keep you safe." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't argue further. Instead, she walked to a nearby cabinet and retrieved a small, sleek device. "Take this. It's a personal shield generator. It won't stop everything, but it might give you an edge." Kieran accepted it with a nod, clipping it to his belt. "Stay here. Lock the doors and don't open them for anyone but me." Aura's hand caught his arm before he could leave. "Be careful, Kieran." He offered her a reassuring smile. "I always am." The eastern perimeter of the estate was dark and silent, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the crystalline hedges. Kieran moved through the shadows with practiced ease, his enhanced senses on high alert. He reached a clearing near the outer wall and crouched behind a decorative pillar. His gaze swept the area, and he spotted them. 3 figures clad in black, their movements precise and coordinated. They carried compact energy rifles and were clearly scanning the area for weaknesses in the estate's defenses. "Amateurs," Kieran muttered under his breath. With a flick of his wrist, he activated the shield generator. A faint, transparent shimmer surrounded him before fading from view. He drew his plasma blade, its soft hum barely audible, and moved toward the nearest intruder. The first operative didn't stand a chance. Kieran disabled him with a quick, silent strike, his blade slicing through the rifle's barrel before delivering a swift blow to the man's temple. The other 2 reacted instantly, spinning to face him, their rifles raised. "Big mistake," Kieran said, his voice low. The first shot grazed his shield, sending a ripple of light across the barrier. Kieran closed the distance in an instant, his blade carving through the second operative's weapon before disarming him with a brutal kick. The final intruder hesitated, clearly weighing his odds. Kieran didn't give him the chance to decide. He lunged, pinning the man to the ground with a knee to his chest. "Who sent you?" Kieran demanded, pressing the blade's edge close to the man's neck. The intruder's mask muffled his voice, but Kieran caught enough to piece it together. "House Thyrus." Kieran cursed under his breath. House Thyrus was one of the Valen family's oldest rivals, and their reach was long. "You're going to deliver a message," Kieran growled. "Tell your employer that if they want to fight, they've got one. But if they come after her again..." He pressed the blade closer, letting the heat singe the man's collar. "They'll regret it." Releasing the operative, Kieran stepped back, watching as the man scrambled to his feet and disappeared into the night. When Kieran returned to the palace, Aura was waiting for him, her expression a mixture of relief and worry. "Everything's fine," he said before she could ask. "Just a few pests who needed reminding that this place is off-limits." Her gaze softened, and she stepped closer. "You're hurt." Kieran glanced down, noticing a fresh scorch mark on his arm where a shot had grazed him. "Just a scratch." Aura shook her head and placed a hand on his chest, her touch light but grounding. "You don't have to do this alone, Kieran. We're in this together." For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, with a tired smile, he covered her hand with his. "Together, huh? I think I can live with that." As the twin moons bathed the estate in silver light, Kieran felt something unfamiliar but welcome. Hope. Whatever dangers lay ahead, he knew he'd face them with Aura by his side. The tension lingered in the air, even after Kieran had assured Aura that the threat was neutralized. He spent the remainder of the night on patrol, circling the estate's grounds with a practiced vigilance. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not yet. By the time the first rays of dawn painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson, he found himself back on the balcony of his quarters. Below, the city of Valen stirred to life, its sprawling markets and sleek transport lanes beginning to hum with activity. Kieran felt like an outsider looking in, a ghost tethered to a world that wasn't his. A soft knock at the door broke his thoughts. "Come in," he called, though his hand instinctively moved toward the blade resting on the table beside him. The door slid open to reveal Rylan, the Valen family's chief advisor. Dressed in the flowing robes of his station, with his graying hair pulled back in a tight knot, Rylan carried an air of authority tempered by weariness. "Kieran," Rylan said, stepping inside. His gaze swept over the room before settling on the mercenary. "I trust the situation last night has been handled." "It has," Kieran replied, leaning back against the railing. "But it's not the last we'll hear from House Thyras." Rylan nodded gravely. "No, it won't be. Their ambition knows no bounds, and they see Aura as a direct threat to their claim on the council seat." Kieran crossed his arms. "Then we need to hit them first? Sitting around and waiting for them to send another squad isn't exactly my style." Rylan raised an eyebrow. "And how would you suggest we do that?" "Intel," Kieran said simply. "Every house has secrets, weaknesses. If we can dig up something on Thyras, we can keep them too busy defending themselves to come after Aura." The older man considered this for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "You're not wrong. But gathering such information is no small feat, especially for someone as visible as the heir to House Valen." "That's why I'll go," Kieran said, pushing off the railing. "I'm not part of this political circus. They won't see me coming." Rylan hesitated, then sighed. "Very well. I'll authorize access to our intelligence network. But if you're caught—" "I won't be," Kieran said with a faint smirk. The underground bazaars of Zenthara were a far cry from the glittering towers of Valen. Here, the air was thick with the scent of spice and grease, and the shadows were alive with whispers and clandestine dealings. Kieran navigated the crowded alleyways with ease, his hood pulled low over his face. He had a name and a location: Narasolis, a broker who specialized in trading information for the right price. If anyone could help him uncover House Thyras' dirty laundry, it was her. The entrance to Nara's lair was tucked behind a derelict cantina, marked only by a faint blue glyph etched into the stone. Kieran pressed his hand against it, and the wall slid open with a faint hiss. Inside, the room was dimly lit, its walls lined with monitors displaying streams of data in languages Kieran didn't recognize. At the center of the chaos sat Nara, a wiry woman with sharp features and cybernetic implants that glowed faintly in the dark. "Kieran," she said without looking up, "you're either very brave or very stupid to come here." "Probably a bit of both," he replied, stepping closer. "I need information on House Thyras." Nara finally looked up, her cybernetic eye whirring as it focused on him. "Thyras? Bold move. What makes you think I'd risk my neck crossing them?" Kieran placed a small device on the table, a data chip containing a substantial sum of credits. "Because I can make it worth your while." She stared at the chip for a long moment before picking it up and slotting it into one of her terminals. "You're lucky I like money more than I like staying out of trouble," she muttered. As the screens around her flickered to life, Kieran watched as streams of data began to unravel. Names, dates, transaction records. Nara worked with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times. "Here we go," she said, leaning back in her chair. "Thyras has been funneling resources to a mining colony on the Outer Rim. Officially, it's a legitimate operation, but these records suggest otherwise." Kieran leaned over her shoulder, his eyes scanning the data. "What are they mining?" Nara tapped a few keys, and a new screen appeared. "Not what who?" "They're running a labor camp, forcing dissidents and political prisoners to work in brutal conditions. If this gets out, it'll destroy their reputation." "Perfect," Kieran said, a grim smile spreading across his face. "Send me everything you've got." Nara hesitated. "You do realize they'll come after you for this, right?" "They don't play nice." "They can try," Kieran said, tucking the data chip into his jacket. but I've got a message to deliver. By the time Kieran returned to the Valen estate, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pristine gardens. He found Aura in the war room, studying a holographic map of the region with Rylan and a handful of advisors. "I've got something you're going to want to see," Kieran said, striding into the room. Aura looked up, her expression brightening at the sight of him. "What is it?" Kieran handed her the data chip, proof that Thyrus has been running a forced labor camp. "If we leak this, it'll cripple their political standing." Rylan took the chip and plugged it into the console, bringing up the data on the central display. Gasps of shock rippled through the room as the extent of Thyrus's operations became clear. "This is damning," Rylan said, his voice low. "If we release this to the council, Thyrus will be finished." Aura's gaze flicked to Kieran, a mixture of gratitude and admiration in her eyes. "You've done more than I could have hoped for." Kieran shrugged. "Just doing my job." But as he looked at Aura, standing tall and resolute in the face of the storm ahead, he couldn't shake the feeling that his job had become something far more personal. And for the first time in a long while, he was okay with that. The council chambers of Valen were a study in opulence and tension. Crystal columns stretched to the domed ceiling, refracting the sunlight into a kaleidoscope of colors. Delegates from the great houses of the Lithian accord sat in raised tiers, their murmurs a low hum that filled the room. Kieran stood at the back, arms crossed, his sharp eyes scanning every corner of the grand hall. He wasn't supposed to be there. Security personnel were expected to remain outside, but Aura had insisted. "I want you where I can see you," she'd said, and Kieran wasn't one to argue with the woman whose life he'd nearly died protecting. At the center of the chamber, Aura stood with a calm determination that belied the stakes of the moment. To her left was Rylan, the ever-composed advisor, holding the data chip that could dismantle House Thyrus. The head of the council, a stern Lithian with cobalt blue skin and silver robes, raised his hand for silence. The murmurs died instantly. "Lady Aura Valen," he intoned, his voice resonating through the chamber. "You have requested an emergency session to present evidence against House Thyrus. Be aware that false accusations will carry severe penalties." Aura inclined her head respectfully. "Understood, Chancellor Varion. What I bring before the council today is no fabrication. It is proof of House Thyrus's crimes against the Accord and its people." Rylan stepped forward, inserting the data chip into the council's central console. The chamber darkened as holographic projections filled the air. Images and reports of forced labor camps, hidden transactions, and testimonies from survivors painted a damning picture. Gasps and whispers erupted among the delegates, followed by angry accusations directed at the representatives of House Thyrus. Their leader, a hulking Lithian named Kaler, stood abruptly, his golden robes flaring. "These are lies," Kaler roared. "Fabrications meant to discredit my house. The Velens are desperate to seize power they do not deserve." Aura stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Do you deny the existence of the labor camps, Kaler? Do you deny the evidence presented here?" Kaler's eyes narrowed. "This is nothing but a human trick," he spat, turning his glare toward Kieran. "That mercenary has no place in our politics." Kieran smirked, but held his tongue. This wasn't his fight, at least not yet. The Chancellor raised his hand again, silencing the room. "The evidence speaks for itself," he said gravely. "House Thyrus will answer for these accusations. Until the investigation is complete, all their privileges and council rights are hereby suspended." Kaler's face darkened with fury, but he said nothing. He stormed out of the chamber, his retinue trailing behind him. Later, in the quiet of the Valen estate, the victory felt more like a relief than a triumph. Aura stood on the balcony of her private quarters, gazing out at the crystalline cityscape. Kieran joined her, leaning against the railing. "You did it," he said, his tone light but sincere. "We did it," she corrected, turning to face him. "Without you, none of this would have been possible." Kieran shrugged. "Just doing my job?" She smiled, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "It's more than a job, Kieran. You've risked your life for me more than once. You've fought for my family, my people. And now," she hesitated, searching for the right words. Kieran raised an eyebrow. Now what? Now I need to let you go, she said softly. House Thyras will retaliate, and they'll target anyone close to me. Staying here would put you in more danger than I'm willing to accept. Kieran frowned. Aura, I've faced worse than House Thyras. I can handle myself. I know you can, she said, stepping closer. But this isn't just about you. It's about us. And I can't bear the thought of losing you because of me. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The unspoken connection they'd shared since that fateful night in the market hung between them, heavy and unresolved. Finally, Kieran sighed. You're serious about this? I am, she said, her voice breaking slightly. But that doesn't mean I don't. He silenced her with a kiss, one hand tangling in her hair as the other rested on her waist. She melted into him, her hands clutching his shoulders as if she never wanted to let go. When they finally pulled apart, Kieran rested his forehead against hers. For what it's worth, Aura, I don't regret a damn thing. Not the arrows, not the fights, not this. Neither do I, she whispered. The next morning, Kieran packed his things. Aura didn't come to see him off, and he understood why. As his transport ascended into the sky, leaving the Valen estate behind, Kieran allowed himself one last look at the crystalline spires glinting in the sunlight. The galaxy was vast, and there would always be another fight, another job. But as he set course for the stars, he knew one thing for certain. Some scars were worth carrying, and some memories would never fade. And somewhere, in the glowing city of Valen, Aura Valen would be carrying those same scars and memories with her.